Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming for this session on women and leadership. Thanks to the Georgetown University for having us here and talk about a topic, an issue that everybody keeps talking about, everybody has an opinion about, and everybody at every conference would want to talk about women empowerment or women in leadership. But what does it mean for women who are actually in leadership? What does it mean for them? How do they see it? What is their perspective? What are their personal stories to a sensitive topic like women in leadership? So I'm going to be moderating this session for the next 50 minutes, and I have these 4 lovely ladies on the stage, which I will introduce in a minute. But before I do that, I just wanted to set the stage with a few statistics that I was going through. The idea of women in leadership or women talking about their rights of equality actually started in the 14th and the 15th century. There is a French-Italian woman by the name of Christine de Pizan from 1364 to 1430. And she was an author, she was a writer, and the first book that was ever written on women empowerment, if you want to call it like that, was a book written by Christine de Pizan, and the book's title was The Book of the City of Ladies. And the next book that she wrote was titled The Treasure of the City of Ladies. She was a court writer for several dukes, and she was also the royal writer for the French royal court under Charles VI. There's another very important lady who almost set the milestone in this whole women empowerment debate. That was in 1908, and she was also French. Her name is Simone de Beauvoir. Now, everybody talks about the British rule in India. Everybody should also know about the last Sikh prince who was sent in exile to Britain, and his name was Raja Duleep Singh. I'm pretty sure everybody must have seen the movie which was made on his life recently. But not a lot of people know that the United Kingdom women's suffragette, which was the idea of women being able to vote, Prince Duleep Singh's daughter was actually one of the leads in that revolution in England in 1900s. She was part of the Pankhurst sisters revolution in England, who led the Women Franchise League. And very famously, I mean, Queen Victoria was her grandmother because the father was in exile. So there is a very famous quote which says, "Have we no control on her?" It said, people who were trying to control her. And then the very next day she went in agitation. She stood outside the palace with a placard saying, "No, you do not." Now, when I go back to my research on India, everybody talks about, oh, don't you know a lot of women in India lead the big banks, private sector, public sector, all banks are led by women. But when you look at the statistics, it's very different. We stand 121st out of 131 countries in female workforce participation. There's a professor by the name of Geeta Sen. She's a professor of Public Health Foundation in India. And she describes this conundrum as miner's canary. Which means it's a proverbial caged bird whose death is an early sign of poisonous gas in the mine. So she equates this whole conundrum of women workforce in India to a miner's canary, because what it means is that there's a sign that everybody talks about it, but nobody listens to the actual statistics that are out there, that women are not in management roles in India. There's been a drop in the women workforce in India in the last 1 decade. So the figures go like this. There's been a drop from 34.8% to 27% between 1993 and 2013. In comparison to China, which in 2013 had 63.9% of women workforce, and Nepal, 79.9%. There's also been a very surprising debate which says, led by a lot of naysayers who say that the women in banks in India managed to be at senior positions because they started their career in 1970s and 80s when the bank jobs in India were 9 to 5. There was not much of demand. It was easy for them. They used to go there, work, come back, because they stick around at the banks for the longest time, which is when there was a requirement for them to climb up the ladder. It was easy for them because the men had already left by then, because it was a boring job. Now, which is a ridiculous explanation to why women are at the senior positions in bank, but this is how the conversation goes in India. So I'm now going to, with this backdrop, will turn towards each of these women panelists that we have and request them to narrate their own stories and their very impressive work experience and the careers that they've managed to pull for themselves. I will start with, on my extreme right, with Sadaf. Now, Sadaf is currently the staff director for the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee on House Foreign Affairs Committee on the Hill. She has worked on Capitol Hill since 2008, where she's filled multiple roles, including legislative assistant and senior policy advisor to Congressman Albier Sayers. Legislative initiatives she helped shepherd through Congress revolve around global health, freedom of press, and foreign assistance. Sadaf, tell us about your experience of reaching where you are. What are the problems that you had to go through? How easy or difficult it was? And if you can, compare the situation that you are here in with, where do you come from?
Pakistan.
With people in Pakistan. Has there been a change? Is there a movement? And what are you doing to make sure that the people come after you do not have to face that in your particular sphere of work?
Well, hello everyone. Thank you all for coming here on a Saturday when the sun is finally out. So I know there are other things you could be doing. I'm very happy to be on this panel and really to actually learn from the women who are sitting beside me. But from my perspective, I went to school right in this neighborhood. I went to UMBC for my undergrad and did my graduate studies here in Johns Hopkins. So I've been around here for a bit, and I, like most college students, had no idea what I wanted to do. I just knew what I was interested in, and that was foreign policy, that was human rights, that was global development. I stumbled upon an internship on Capitol Hill, and that's kind of where it started. I immediately knew that's where I wanted to be. And I was very fortunate that the congressman who gave me my very first internship is still the person who's my boss today, which is a little bit uncommon on Capitol Hill. We're known for high turnover, I would say. And I just worked up the ladder. I interned, and then I was hired as a staff assistant. And after that, you become a policy person, and you kind of be able to move over, through the ranks. And I was able to move on to the committee out of his personal office a few years ago. I now get to manage Latin America policy for the Democrats by and large, so I can advise him and help forward his agenda, but I can also advise any other member, staff other members of Congress, how they travel, where they want to go, what bills they might want to have made into law. So that's a very short summary of what I do now, and I would say that the challenges, we were talking earlier before we stepped out here about how all of us come from some form of a male-dominated field or career or what have you, national security, construction, IT, whatever it is. I don't know a job or an industry that isn't male-dominated. So I think that we all will face that no matter what we do. And my biggest strength, to be honest, has been trying to let my work speak for itself. And being very lucky that the person I particularly happen to work for, the congressman I work for, incredibly supportive, wants to promote from within, wants to see us do well. He himself was a refugee from Cuba, and he really understands what the opportunity, migrating to this country can bring to people. And so I'm very fortunate that that's someone who I have able to lift me up, but that's not the case for everyone. And that's certainly not the case, I think, where my family comes from in Pakistan might not be the case for some people in India. And so we were also speaking backstage is the biggest difference is there are more and more women going into the workforce throughout the subcontinent, but are they being given the tools and the opportunity to excel? Or are they kind of said, okay, well, you've got this job, you're an entry-level position, you're an admin person, but what are they doing to make sure that your voices are being heard, that when you're at the table, you get to speak just as much as somebody else does? And so I think that is actually one of the biggest challenge, things that, aside from, unfortunately, what we're learning more and more, what most of us have already known to be true, the overt harassment that happens in certain workplaces. But for us, it's more of the little things, I think, that get to me is being spoken over when you're at a table, not being acknowledged when you're speaking, people assuming that I'm a guy instead of a girl if I travel through Latin America because they don't have any women in senior leadership roles in the government to talk to. Things like that, are something that we fight through every day. And for me, at least, I think being there, being in the room and showing up and saying, this is who I am and this is where I'm from and this is how I got here, that's really the best thing we can do. And doing everything we can to find the mentor sitting next to you and latch onto them and ask them for as much advice as you can, listen to whatever their guidance is, and realize that the network that you create, they're going to be the people that propel you forward. They're going to be your cheerleaders. And so that's, don't want to take up too much time, and roughly a little bit about what I've seen over the last few years.
Thank you, Sadaf. I do have a few questions which I will ask towards the end once all the ladies are done. But ladies, be careful. Whatever you speak, I'm going to note the questions. We now turn left to Ranji Nagaswamy. Ranji Nagaswamy is the Chief Executive Officer of Hertel Callaghan. Is that how you pronounce it? Hertel Callaghan, a pioneer of outsourced chief investment officer, fiduciary model management, over 20 billion in client assets. They are client-centric, conflict-free investment firm that sells no investment products. Rather, the firm manages complete custom-designed investment program for families and institutional investors. Ranji, talk to us about how successful it is for women in financial services, or how difficult it is. I was noting that in 1963 was the first time ever that a woman managed to buy a seat for herself as a trader at the New York Stock Exchange. Have things moved away from this conversation in financial services, or are we still stuck in that 1963 model?
So I think we're stuck in that model in two ways. First is women entering the financial services industry, and then women ascending in the financial services industry. Both remain issues. I do think that it's now far more women entering, but the ascension part is still an issue. And some of this is an industry, parts of this industry, because it was probably completely unclear from the introduction what I do. So I will try and explain, mostly because of the way it was written, so nothing to do with you.
Please do.
But financial services is so broad. It goes from insurance to the users of capital, treasurers, corporate treasurers who need to raise debt to finance their projects, finance their businesses, finance ministers trying to raise capital to finance their country's budgets. The savers of capital, you and me, investing our hard-earned savings, but also the large pooled sources of capital, pension funds that are, among others, that have sovereign wealth funds, large pools of assets to invest. And then people like me, the intermediaries. And there's most of us in financial services are intermediaries. We are either bankers, we are asset managers, investing the assets on behalf of individual clients. And that's where I fit in. I am running today a $20+ billion firm that invests on behalf of institutions and families. So asset management, which is the only thing I know, I'm a one-trick pony, that's all I know and can speak of within financial services for 30 years, it's all I've done, is probably the most underappreciated part of financial services, and we love it that way. So the investment bankers can be fighting all over all of the deals, but the pressure, what you hear about in finance very often, except for times when people like Wells Fargo make the news for all the wrong reasons, which is predatory lending and bad practices, you hear a lot about the bankers on Wall Street. And those are, for the kids among you from Georgetown, coveted jobs. They probably come to campus to recruit. Those are the 80, 100-hour weeks. Asset management I think of as a real gem, because this is where we get to use our knowledge, whether it's on economics, human behavior, finance for sure, all with a view to making money in capital markets, which of course is a zero-sum game. If someone wins, someone else loses. So again, you can talk about the value of this in finance. But now let me come back to the question at hand. It has been really hard for women to break into finance, largely because of the way relationships have been built and the way these jobs are recruited for. So today, a lot of financial jobs are recruited for over the internet. I really hope that that changes things, and certainly who's in school and understands what this industry is about. I'll speak a little bit to my personal journey and rising up within financial services. So extraordinarily modest story to tell, so it'll be brief. Grew up in the very dusty suburbs of Ahmedabad, India, in the northwest, in Gujarat. Classical Indian dancer, never thought I would ever be in financial services. Came here to go to business school, met my future husband. Now we've been married almost over 28 years. And went into the investment industry entirely by accident. So no clue when I started in the industry in 1986, yes, I know you can add, that I would survive and thrive for 30 years. Rose up within the ranks mostly for two reasons, and I want to talk a little bit about this, which is advancement to me in financial services came from a lot of risk-taking on my part. Seeing there were opportunities and always, and particularly the gritty ones, complexity, quite honestly, the men didn't want them, and I would raise my hand. And so becoming known as a problem solver, becoming known as someone who could go into a situation, analyze it quickly, make sense of it, and then turn it around, is, I sort of now see myself as a change agent. And I never set out on that journey to think of myself that way. So becoming credible by managing various types of investments and then going into management. And I would say the CEO job. So now I would say the hardest thing for me in terms of roles in my career was finding the right place for my ambition to actually run a business. It's an extraordinarily white American male-dominated at the top in the industry. And someone had to make a bet. And never lose sight of this, right? This is the importance of mentors. Someone has to make a bet, and it's usually a man. And so I'm delighted to see so many men in this, because usually all the men walk right by women in leadership. And so it isn't possible if we don't have enlightened leaders at the top. And because who's there now is a man, it has to very often be a man who sees something, first of all, who sees someone who can advance the mission, right? I have to succeed in building a great business. No one gave this to me because they have some kind of diversity idea in their head. I was the right man for the job, maybe another way to say this too. So advancing to me was earning the credibility, raising my hand, being a risk taker, and being smart enough to understand what the next job required. So not just doing the job I had at the moment, but fulfilling everything they would need in the next job. Left the business, private sector in 2010 to join Mayor Bloomberg for 2 years. For me, that was a very pivotal moment. Sonal and I are both fellows at the Aspen Institute, a transformational part of my life's journey. And in the Aspen Institute fellowships, which are really for leaders to ask themselves, what is our responsibility to build a good society? It was during that time that I said to myself, you know, I've spoken a lot about the public pension crisis in the United States. And in 2010, I decided to do something about it and joined Mayor Bloomberg as his first chief investment advisor for the New York City pension system. Today, I run Hurdle Callahan. I also founded the 15th Fellowship at Aspen for leaders in finance, because I am so convinced that finance is the engine that drives society. Without credit, without pension funds, bank accounts, mutual funds, there would not be progress. Maybe a bold statement, but I really believe it to be true. The problem is finance has become too much about the financiers themselves. And so my ambition is to really connect, through the right leaders, connect finance and society. What are the problems I faced? I will tell you, as my son and husband sit here in the audience, they were mostly personal. When you are on such a life's mission and journey, and I never stopped working through the kids' early years, there are enormous sacrifices that are made. And I couldn't do it. I'm going to embarrass them. Without them, I think of Bo and Jay and our daughter Mira as giving me the love and the courage to do what I need to do. but quite honestly, also the kick in the pants to get up and get going and to take the big risks. And so that support system, I would say, was invaluable. The other thing I would point to as problems I faced, to your direct question, was actually my own ambition. I think my ambition exceeded my abilities from time to time, and coming to terms with it, and real massive setbacks in that way, and then having the grit to get up and do it all over again, and want to do it all over again. So I know we'll come back to other things in Q&A.
Ranji, I'm tempted to ask you a question before I go to the other ladies. I'm sorry. To what you just said, a kick in the pants. There was this huge debate about what women wear to work, especially in the financial services, in the financial industry. And there was a case, which I'm not going to quote the name of the company, but a woman who was a very senior person at a bank managed to bring their biggest client to the bank, but she still wasn't given a promotion. She filed a case against the bank, she won it, and when people were asked, why were the other senior men not willing to give her the promotion, the response was, she dresses up like a man and we don't like it. Do you face that problem when you go to work? Do you every morning wake up and think, I have to dress up in my pants and I can't wear a dress or a skirt? Does that change anything
I was
for
just
you?
cold. I was to wear a dress. Look, here's what I'd say. 30 years ago when I started in this business, and I had $40 to my name, I bought 2 polyester suits for my summer internship, first summer internship in Wall Street, a gray and a navy blue, and I wore them all summer.
Okay.
And gray and navy blue, why? Because that was the uniform. Thank God we've come a long way. So there was just no doubt in my mind that I had to dress the type, that I had to have, you know, a blouse up to here. And so the stereotypes were all true. And in the 80s, and 90s, there were very few women in the industry, very few women starting out. I really hope today we blaze our own path. I really hope today, quite frankly, I'm sure it's true. Our daughter is in financial services. She has a clear sense of what Mom, you're going to wear that to work? She said, I can't. So I think there's an age and stage for things, perhaps. But I think it's a lot looser now.
Okay. More on that later, but we'll turn now to my right, Ms. Amita Poole. Amita has served as a Chief Executive Officer at IIPL USA, which is an infrastructure company, since July 2014. She serves as a point of contact for customers and international affiliates, and she advocates on innovation, technology, and best practices to address urban challenges faced by cities, states, and countries. Prior to IIPL, Ms. Poole served as a resident consultant to Ekin Gump. She principally consulted on Indian government affairs and US government contracting for large architectural engineering firms and construction contracts. She's also served as a chief of staff to the architect of the Capitol. Her responsibilities included assisting the architecture in managing a budget of over $1 billion, day-to-day maintenance, operation, development, and preservation of 17.4 million square feet of buildings and 553 acres of land throughout Capitol Hill. So over to you, Amita.
Thank you. So I wrote some comments that I wanted to talk about, and so mine comes from a very personal place, and I thought that it would be good to share what women face from a personal standpoint more so than just from an industry standpoint. So I'm going to begin with a quote that Indira Gandhi often spoke, and she said, "To be liberated, woman must feel free to be herself, and not in rivalry of men, but in the context of her own capacity and her own personality." And I think that's very true for any woman that's in business today or in leadership position, that they don't forget that they are women, and we bring something to the table that's very different than what men bring to the table. So as a CEO of a subsidiary, ILFS, which is one of the largest Indian infrastructure development companies, I sit with the board of directors who are all men. So there's about 13 different board members, and they're all men. And I've come to understand that the power of diversity of gender and thought, culture, and skill sets all can be brought by women to the workforce. And having been part of this organization now for the last 4 years, I come from a different perspective, which is that that organization gave me a chance to prove that women can sit at the boardroom and be in a very, very male construction-dominated environment. And they're an Indian company, so this is not speaking of companies here in the US, but rather speaking of a company in India who promotes women and empowers women. So I often sit and think about what it is that makes a leader. And so I'll speak to you from my own personal journey. So about 4 years ago, I was watching my son graduate from college. And as he was crossing the stage, my phone kept ringing and I answered the phone. And it was my neighbor. And he says, "Your house is on fire and it's gone." So we watched my son finish and we turned around and looked at each other and said, "You know, what's more important than watching him graduate? Because everything else is material." So we go back to not a home, an hotel room, and my mother calls and says, "I have stage 4 breast cancer." And we take that with a deep sense of, well, what else can happen tomorrow? And what does happen tomorrow is my mother-in-law has a massive stroke and is immobilized, all happening within a week of each other. And the CEO of Violet Fest picks up the phone and he called me and he said, "You have the strength to get over this because women bring strength to the table and you're able to juggle family and work and life. And I have faith that you will bring this company into the US and you'll do what needs to be done to help grow this company." So it's been during this time, the last 4 years, that I've really recognized what it is that it means to be a woman and what we do to juggle our family, our work, and our lives. And as you pointed out so clearly, it's your own self-doubt that holds you back more than anything else on earth. And so what did I learn from this whole adversity that happens in life? I learned that we're resilient as women. We're able to pick up the pieces. We're able to rebuild our home. We're able to take care of our parents. And we're able to grow a company, an infrastructure company that does $40 billion worth of work around the world. What do I take and what do I help pass on to women in my organization? I ask them to not forget empathy and not to forget that you bring to the table something that truly is different than what a man brings, because you have that instinct within you to understand what someone else is going through. And the power of what we do as women is we are able to bring an organization together that has so many different people and give them the opportunity to be themselves and to challenge them to be better people. And so I think that it's not about gender alone, it's about what you are as a leader and what you can bring to the table. And I think it's very important that women face these challenges and speak about them to other women, because it helps them grow and it helps them understand that adversity is something that's going to bring growth to you, bring resilience to you, and that you as women are capable of running large organizations as well as juggling work and family and life.
Thank you, Amita. That was quite a story. You should probably write a book on this. We now turn to my left with Sonal Shah. Sonal is the Executive Director and Professor of Practice at Georgetown University. Sonal is an economist and entrepreneur and has spent her career focused on economic policy and actionable innovation in public and private sector. She has led policy innovations at the White House for the President Obama, and Treasury Department for President Clinton. An international economist, she set up the central bank in Bosnia. Wow, I want to know more of that. And implemented poverty reduction strategies in Africa and financial crisis in Asia and Latin America. Over to you, Sonal. Talk to us about your story and more about in your space of public policy. How do you see women breaking the glass ceiling? What are the problems that they face?
Well, first of all, it's awesome to be on the stage with incredible women and who are doing amazing things in every part of the economy. And sometimes I think we, in our conferences, we tend to highlight one or the other. But what's nice to see is just how many are representative of public policy, of business, but different types of businesses, not even the same. So awesome to be here and awesome to know people I didn't even know. So let me just start with, I'm a rule breaker in general. So my career starts at, I hate rules. And so how do I find a career that is not about the rules? I've had 4 careers in the last 25 years. So I started as an economist at the Department of Treasury. I started as a civil servant at the Department of Treasury, found myself willingness to take risk. And I want to just agree with Ranji's point. The willingness to set up in 1995 when the Undersecretary of Treasury says, would somebody be willing to go to Sarajevo right after we had finished bombing to help set up a central bank? Yes. And largely, and I think what I learned about myself in that process is there were no rules. The first time the United States was trying to do nation building, nobody knew what they were doing, and I got to run around and figure out how to do my job. And I didn't know what my job was. But the willingness, I think, to say, I don't know what the job is, but I'll go and do it and figure out how to do that job. And I think that was very much a learning for me. It was like my first job at the Treasury Department. I'd been there for 2 years. I wanted to leave because I was bored. And this was like the coolest thing to go do and go live in Sarajevo. Landed when there was on-site landing only. There was no instrument landing. It was snowing, and the pilot basically says, if you feel the plane pull up, just know we couldn't see the runway. But you know, it was the best career move ever. I think from day one, had I not done that, I'm not sure I would have been willing to take the risks that I did in the rest of the time. So I stayed at the Department of Treasury for 7 years. All of those things that you read about Asian financial crisis and all of that was just part of being at the department and a willingness to raise my hand and say, I'll go do that. I'll go move to Indonesia during the crisis. I'll go, but there's just the willingness to take a bit of that risk. I think I got known at Treasury because of my willingness to take risks, not because I was a great economist, because I wasn't, but because I was willing to go do things that others weren't willing to do. I left the Treasury Department to join Goldman Sachs. Seems like a natural thing to do, right? Again, not a job that was defined. I was given a job that says we don't know what the job is, but you got to figure out what the job is. We want someone to do something that might be, and those of you that think about Goldman Sachs, you're like, oh, you come in as an analyst, you come in, I went in my mid-30s, so I was not any of those, but I was willing to go to the analyst class and sit in an analyst class and take the trainings, get my Series 7 licenses. Never intention of being a banker, don't want to be a banker, but just to learn what it is. And really ended up working with then the chairman of Goldman Sachs, Hank Paulson, on setting up an environmental policy. What does a Goldman Sachs do in the environment and what could they do? And this was in 2004, at a time when the idea of clean tech investing was just starting. People had done basic amounts of it, but really wasn't that much clean tech investing taking place. So I was at Goldman for about 4 years. And because of the risk, let me come back to Treasury, Sheryl Sandberg was the chief of staff to Larry Summers. Because I had taken that risk in Sarajevo, people knew me at the Treasury Department. Sheryl calls up and says, Google is setting up this thing called google.org, a new type of philanthropy that will do investments and will do philanthropy. Would you like to come to run the international development piece? Great. Didn't know what the title was. Didn't really know what the job was going to be. They had never done a philanthropy before. You just got to be willing to pick up the pieces and say, oh, I got a fairly decent job at Goldman. I work for the chairman. Do I leave that to go work? All of you may say Sheryl Sandberg is really important now, but at that time, she was not the same Sheryl Sandberg. So you had to be willing to take a risk and say, you know, can I move to across the country, actually living in California, and set up this thing called Google.org. And I mostly did the international development piece of that. So I did most of my investments in India and East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda. And that meant spending about 6 months in India, Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, figuring out what types of investments, what to do. I didn't know I knew India, but I didn't really know Kenya, Tanzania, or Uganda, but the willingness to go and live there and figure that out. I left Google because I joined the transition team for President Obama in 2008. Again, didn't know if he was going to win, just you have to set up a transition team, was part of technology innovation, because I worked at Google for 2 years, I know technology now. But it was a learning of not taking that stance that sometimes we as women do, which is like, I don't know anything about technology. How could I lead a transition team on technology? I had to force myself to say, I'm going to learn it, and I know enough people that I can figure out what the job is, even without knowing what the job actually is, and not being afraid to be sitting at a table that you didn't, sometimes we feel like frauds at a table, but I can figure out technology, and my brother can figure out technology, I can figure out technology. Competitive by nature, yes. But, so I took the job, and in that, the president set up an office called the Office of Social Innovation. How do we innovate in the social sector? I stayed there for 3.5 years. I left the government and took about 1.5 years off, so no working. Decided that I didn't need a job. I didn't want a job. I needed to do something that figured out what I wanted to do, not what was the coolest thing that came to me. So much of my career up to this point is people offering jobs and not so much me thinking about what I wanted to do. So in that 1.5 years, took the time, honestly would never have thought about coming to a university because it was not in my lexicon of thinking as an economist, but got to come here thanks to a great provost and a president, but also a donor that was willing to say, I'll give you the money with no strings attached. $10 million investment in setting up a center, figure out what it could look like. And it was awesome. I mean, you get to create an institution. It's not an institution that's handed to you, so a willingness to learn. So 3 things I have learned, at least for myself in my own life. 1, take risks and don't be afraid of it. 2, I'm a good startup person. Like, I have to be willing to admit to that. I don't necessarily like to grow organizations, but I like the startup culture. It's like the type of person I am. But a willingness to admit what you're good at and what you're not good at, not because you can't do it, but what do you like doing? And that's actually important. And 3, surrounding myself, actually, as I've gotten older, with women who help me think through, how do I address the next challenge? Do you face the same things? And the men have been extraordinarily, in all of my jobs, it's because men have been supporters and have taken risks on me. But it's also been helpful in the last 5 to 7 years of having women who you can share your experiences with and learn from, because it's a willingness to ask, how did you do that? How do you think about that? And how did you negotiate your salary? How did you do all of those things? And those are very helpful, but sometimes men can't help you with that because they don't face the same challenges, but women have faced those challenges. So having that friendship, having those relationships, and having the willingness to have those conversations has been super helpful.
Thank you, Sonal. I'm going to ask a few questions from all the 4 panelists, but before that, I forgot to introduce myself. Men wouldn't do that. I did that because I'm a woman, but I will introduce myself. I'm Ridhika, and I am the head of the Indian Chambers of Commerce. We are a policy advocacy and represent the Indian industry here in the US. That out of the way. Most of your comments were about, when we joined the workplace, we took the risk. We were the first to raise our hand on stuff that was thrown at us. And we were the first ones to say, yeah, if we need to do something new, we will do that. What were the men around you in the same group thinking or doing at that point? Were they not willing to take that risk? Is that why you managed to climb the ladder? Or was there a different dynamic that was happening at that point? What would you want to say about that?
Every job I took from a man. So the men failed, right?
Okay.
And that's just a law of numbers. It's not like in particular something. I love your startup story, but for me, a lot of the early stage, someone else had the job and they failed at it, so there was an opening and I got to do it. But I do think, I want to turn this around a little bit to what is our responsibility now as leaders to create those openings, to create that, I love Madeleine Albright, who said there's a special place in hell for women who don't, successful women who don't turn around and help bring women back up. So I'll tell you, at the workplace, we've had to create very conscious ways. For example, we do senior searches quite a bit. We're looking for talent. And we required our headhunter to have 50% of the roster be underrepresented minorities, women, and so different ways of, very early in the process, you have to be very clear about, I don't want a candidate pool that represents what's available in the market, because that will be a very predictable pool. So I think as a leader, the way I would say it is, it's extraordinary how conscious we have to be, conscious bias, to be so conscious about processes. There are ways that we write job descriptions which turn women off. There are ways that, places that you post your job descriptions that only certain groups of people go to. So it's extraordinary. I have a very, very strong chief talent officer, and she's very aware. She ran the diversity initiative at Expedia before she joined me. And so it's extraordinary how much science there is to how you find people with diverse backgrounds and even diverse approaches and move them in their careers. So sorry.
I think that's an exception, because I was reading somewhere that the global workforce, the women global workforce, at the junior level, there's 20 to 30% women at the junior level workforce. By the time they get to the middle management, it's 10%. By the time they get to the board management, it's 5% or 6.5%. A big reason for that is because, clearly your case is an exception when you just mentioned about your HR person who's very mindful of this. But most of the times what happens is that this idea of bringing women at the senior management is a role delegated to the HR, and it falls under bringing diversity to the workplace. Many times management forget that it's not about bringing diversity, but it's a strategic management decision that needs to happen at a senior level so that they can involve more women. But as I said, your case seems to be an exception. Sadaf, pardon me, I don't want to ask you your age, but you do look young. When you go to other countries and you represent your committee talking about foreign policy, do you get judged for how you look and how young you look, and do people add like judgment to that many times? Because men wouldn't have that.
Yeah, I'm 30 years old. I have no problems admitting that. I travel a lot for work, and I'm very lucky I get to travel and represent the US government. I get to represent Congress, and just so you are all aware, Latin America, Europe, South Asia, Africa, I've traveled to all of those regions, and you will have different experiences based on which culture you're in. But I alluded to this earlier, many times, this still happens. I'm always seated as Mr. instead of Miss. And I know it says Miss on my bio. And on top of that, there's protocol, how you sit at a table. And I'm very lucky. I'm generally the lead Democrat on a trip, right? So whoever's leading the trip, I sit right next to them. Someone always has to come up to me and, are you sure you're in the right chair? Is this your chair? And so that happens. There is a little ogling here and there, and that's every industry, and that has nothing to do with my age or how I look or what country I'm in. That's walking down M Street, or walking in Delhi or walking in Buenos Aires. So that's for better or for worse, a part of the game. And so I think it's just a matter of how we respond to it and how we take it in. And something that everyone here has spoken about is taking the risk. But one of the things that I think they're all probably being a little bit modest about is, whether you're a guy or a girl, your priority should be to be the person in the room that knows the most, be the most prepared. So when someone asks you for something, you can raise your hand and you can say, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. And so it comes up. I think one of the what we call microaggressions is you get talked over a lot. This happens in every country in the world, in every type of meeting. You speak and someone just acts like it didn't happen. And there's a lot of people here in the audience that are nodding along. And sometimes what it takes is one of your colleagues to say, excuse me, she's trying to say something. And so that happens, and it is a part of the way we live our lives. And I think the only thing that changes it is us handling it a certain way. You stick to what you're going to say, you keep your head cool, you just keep going. And you build a strong network around you of people who are supportive. There's always going to be naysayers, but you have your cheerleaders in your corner, and whether they are men or women, they're mindful of the situation around them. And I think that is probably the best way moving forward. But it happens.
When I joined the workforce, I was very young, and I was given the responsibility of heading an office. And for better or for worse, I think I wasn't thinking right, because I used to walk into the meetings wearing clothes that I'm not supposed to wear, which was like very not my type. But I used to wear fake 0-number glasses just to look a little older. But then I realized it wasn't working. And I was like, I'm going to dress the way I want to. And I just did what I had to, and then things just turned around, because it's very important for women to realize that we don't have to adjust to what is expected out of us, but others have to.
But I do want to add to Ranji's point. I think there's some, it's nice, one of the things that I think is super valuable is understanding that at certain levels of your career, it's about merit, and after other levels of your career, it's about politics. And it's small p politics, and you have to play them. And we shouldn't kid ourselves that, it's always going to be merit-based. It's not true.
That is right.
I remember when I was at Goldman and we did our 360 reviews, they used to hold a separate panel for women, and they said, we want you to know that you will be modest on your 360 review. Men are not modest on their 360 reviews, and they remind their bosses on a regular basis of all the great things that they're done. And the women will be like, I expect my boss to know. And it is our responsibility when we're in positions of leadership to remind women of those things at various points in their career and not assume that that is going to happen. And it's not a negative on men, it's a personality difference, and you have to know the personalities you're working with, because it's different on a workplace. But we do have to play the small p politics. And I don't think we should assume that you don't have to play it and it's always going to be merit-based. And I'm always, I'm a rule breaker at all spaces, but also knowing when to break a rule and when to play along with the rule and being mindful of how to use those rules in the right way. I think it's super valuable and super important, but we have a huge responsibility. And I think sometimes we don't always think about it, being mindful of who you hire, being mindful of how to help people negotiate their salaries. I mean, I had to catch myself when I first was hiring at Georgetown, when the first woman I was hiring wanted to negotiate her salary, and I thought I had worked out the band as far as I could. And I was like, right, would I take it differently if it was a male and if it was a female? And so I had to force myself to sit there and say, okay, she has a point. She's right about the experience. How do I work through that? But we all have our own implicit biases, because I would not have negotiated that way. But it's my implicit bias. It was not somebody else's bias. So having to also own our biases as women and knowing when we're being biased ourselves to also how to bring other people along in that process. So I think there's a huge value to that. And I think, on the Hill and other places, remarkable in the foreign policy community, or in the policy community in general, making sure that when you're in a position that if there's a woman that that should be qualified for that job, finding that person to do that. I mean, I've seen Nisha do this before, but I've seen other people, do that for her. And I think this matters, that we all kind of pay attention and think about when to bring people along and not dismiss that concept.
That's well put. Thanks, Sonal. I'm going to open the floor for questions from these lovely ladies. If anybody has questions, please feel free to raise your hand. Sure. We'll go with the lady first. Do we have a mic?
I need one. I'm
okay.
Raji Ramanan, and the career management for the executive degree programs here in Georgetown at the business school. And I've worked in this space a lot, and really would like to get your views on this. One question we always get put forward when it comes to women in leadership roles. The preparedness for leadership roles is one thing. And always there's been a lot of criticism around yes, you guys make it there, but then sustaining yourself there and getting into a comfort zone, and then, as Ranji rightly pointed out, giving a lending hand to another woman. These are all things that have been kind of questioned, and she addressed that place in hell for those who don't help another woman as a woman leader. But really speaking, what was your experience in terms of getting there? It was a lot of stories we heard, but staying there and making it sustainable and becoming a role model as a leader, not necessarily just as a woman leader. I'd like your thoughts on that. Thank you.
How do you sustain yourself to be at that ladder climbing up consistently? Ladies?
Does Amita want to take?
Amita, do you want to take that?
How do you sustain yourself? I think it's to carry yourself with knowingness. So I think a lot of it is your personal confidence, and I think that's really what it all boils down to for women, in my opinion. And so, I'm on a construction site probably 4 or 5 days out of the week. I have a hard hat on. I'm there with probably 500 men. But it's gaining their respect through holding your confidence and knowing what you say is going to be heard, and that it's heard as not a woman, but as a person who knows the business. And I challenge all of my superintendents on the field and all of my foremen to hire women. I challenge them, and I think it's important that we bring women into fields that are so male-dominated, and break those rules. Break the rules of it's okay to wear this and still put a hard hat on, and I can be on a construction site, and it's okay. And there's nothing wrong with that because I'm confident in who I am. And I think that goes, as you listen to their stories, you find there's a level of confidence that comes from them. And that, to me, is probably what women need to display in any profession that they're in. And moving on. Yeah, I do. I think it's the most important thing that a woman can have is confidence in herself.
Anybody want to add something to that?
Or to add something,
please.
Because we've spoken a lot about how to bring women up into the workforce, and some of my colleagues here on the panel, you are in a position to have a chief talent officer, to have folks that can systematically from the top down change the way the system works, and that's remarkable and unbelievable. But from my industry, that's not an option, right? Capitol Hill doesn't operate that way, and there are other places that don't operate that way yet, and hopefully we will follow that model one day. But in the meantime, for someone like myself, who is not yet at the level where some of these ladies are, that can have that kind of control, there are so many, I would say, smaller but no less important things that we can do. I'm only sitting on this panel because another woman thought of me. And that's why I'm here. And we can do things, whether it's getting coffee with your colleagues, asking around for recommendations and resumes when you're looking to hire someone, whether it's an intern or a staff director, making sure that you are doing your best even on a small scale, or just to try and cull all the right information, knowing the information around you, having all of the tools to know which fellowships exist that help underrepresented communities, and making sure you're disseminating that information as much as you can. I'm sure everybody up here, we get emails every day for somebody, a friend of a friend, trying to get a coffee, trying to have an informational interview. I try very hard to take as many of those as I can, and knowing that because the traditional workforce, the traditional pool, the traditional network won't include that person's resume, and knowing that they're going to be just as every bit qualified, if not more, and knowing that I wouldn't have this opportunity if someone didn't have a coffee with me, if someone didn't email Sonal for me, or none of those things would happen. And so I'm very grateful that there are women who are trying to change it from the top down, and I think that's amazing. But especially since there are definitely a lot of folks here that or look to be in college, look to be at a place where you're going to be looking for jobs at the beginning of your career, know that there are a lot of women and men out here that want to do everything we can to help you, whether it's just to tell you what are the right listservs to sign up for, or who to talk to, or help you understand what jobs might be helpful. I mean, there's a lot of this micro level stuff that goes on, and we should all be trying to do as much as we can to make sure you know that, and to make sure that we all want to be a resource.
Thank you, Sadaf. Any more questions? We'll go with that. And probably the last question from, did you raise a hand?
Hi, I'm Dr. Juhi Jagyasi. I'm an anesthesiologist, and I just stumbled upon this conference today while I was doing a fashion show in DC. But I'm very glad I'm here, and my main question is about women undercutting women. I know that men, we're talking about women empowerment, but when I started being in a different industry, being a physician, I started venturing in the fashion industry. I went through meeting all women, and I wanted to empower them and build a network of 50 states handling each area. But I noticed that men would give me more chances, but the women cut the women to grow further. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm going to add another question to this and then probably request the panelists to answer the questions together.
Thank you. I just want to say thank you for coming. You're all amazing women, and it's so inspiring to hear you speak. My name is Alicia. I'm a student at Georgetown University, and I was just wanted to ask, you've talked a lot about the challenges of being a woman in the workplace, and I want to know some of the times that being a woman has really made you stood out and the times that being a woman has helped you in the workplace.
So women undercutting women and how other women have helped. Who would want to go first with the first question? Have you ever been pushed by another woman?
I mean, look, we're all competitive.
Yeah.
And I it's funny sometimes because I always wonder, does anybody in the male, do males say, oh, men are undercutting men? Because in some ways, I think they do. Because I've worked in finance and I've worked in technology, and they're just doing exactly the same thing. They're all playing politics to get ahead of each other, and somebody will go whisper to somebody else of who's good and who's not. And I see it, but I do think, and I think your point is a fair point, I think the competition amongst us, because the pool is so small, is super competitive. So we're always trying to beat each other out because the pool is 1 out of 10, not 9 out of 10, right? So that feels much worse, and it is much worse because it's a smaller pool. But again, I think it's the point that Ranji's making, and everybody here actually is making, is to say it's also our responsibility at the same time to expand the pool. And too often, if one of us isn't willing to step in at that moment and expand the pool, even at the loss of ourselves, it's not going to expand because the pool will stay at 1 out of 10. So we have to get to at least 4 out of 10 in order for the competitiveness to not feel so ridiculous. But it is ridiculous. I mean, let's be clear. I've succeeded in my career mostly because of men. But at the same time, I can think back and say at least there were 3 women that took a risk and that were willing to go out of their way, to your point earlier, of a partner at Goldman Sachs who met with any woman that wanted to meet with her. Any woman at Goldman Sachs that wanted to meet with her, right? Now that's a learning to say, wow, she was willing to say, and she was not gonna make it after a certain point, but she was willing to go and say, I'm gonna expand the pool. So the pool gets an expansion. So I think that's a responsibility we have, and it's a responsibility we should take and own it. And it's hard. It's not gonna be easy, but we have to fight that battle, and it's gonna be a battle that's worth fighting. And I think it's super important.
I think you.
So there have been words used, empathy has come up. I want to go back to your question about has it helped to be a woman on every single day. And the way I think about it is I've come around to this notion of the thing that I do uniquely because I'm a woman is this idea of integration. And you brought it up in the extraordinary story you told about your life, and thank you for honoring us with that. With this idea that there are lots of people in the world who see one big thing. And my job, and I really believe it's because of my gender, because of the way I grew up, because of expectations in society and the way I had to deal with them, because perhaps women are better listeners. I think there are plenty of men who are good listeners too. I do think our ego gets less in the way. I do think that unfortunately the humility goes to self-doubt too much. So it's that confidence and humility balance that actually is necessary. But this notion of integration, I have come around to thinking that many, many women that I really admire as leaders. Think of Indra Nooyi. I think she extraordinarily, it's not like she knows one thing particularly, but she brings it together. And I think that comes from great listening, really open mind, not having to be right every time. Sorry, man, you carry this huge burden. But that might be one response.
So I think I'm going to end the discussion here, but I want to leave a fascinating story, because I think, of course, women help women, men help women as well. But the story where both of them came together is, and I'm not going to name the company, but there's a big American defense company which had a very senior person as a woman, and she was trying to make a deal with another country on selling the products of that defense company. And she had a team of men, and she was leading it. She went to another country, and they were sitting in a meeting. Every time the other party used to ask for something, the woman used to respond with what they can and they cannot do. And the moment she used to respond, the other party used to look at all the junior men staff, that what is their view on what the woman is saying, although the woman was their boss. And this happened for a day in that negotiation. And the second day onwards, this one man, a junior staff member from the team led by the woman, went up to the other side and said, "Don't look at us when you're asking a question and she responds. She's the boss. If she says this can or cannot be done, that's the last word. So don't look at us. It's very humiliating for us." And they were like, "Oh, okay. This is how you function. I'm sorry. Okay, fine. If she says, we will accept it." So the next day onwards, every time she used to say something, men stopped looking at the other men. And that was a big message given by those junior staff members saying, she's the boss. So I think that works pretty well at corporate setup as well. But thank you so much, ladies. Thank you for all your stories and your experiences shared. I hope that the audiences would go back with something in learning. Thank you so much. Thank you.